Welcome back, everyone, to the third and final episode of the story of William McKinley, as told by Extra History and as interpreted by me. I'm excited to dive into this, especially because I got to spend a couple of days here in Northeast Ohio with my friend Matt Beat from the channel Mr. Beat, and we did some presidential content that's going to be coming on his channel this fall, specifically about Presidents McKinley and Garfield, who were both from Northeast Ohio. We visited their presidential homes and libraries and museums, and it was a lot of fun. Had a blast, and so I'm excited for you guys to see that. I know Matt's going to do a fantastic job telling that story. So this is part 3 from Extra History. I'll put the link down in the description. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2 of my reaction to this, the link is in the description for episode 1. Obviously, he's my hometown president, so I'm heavily biased toward him, but I'll do my best to add to the story where I can. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
One last time, we return to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, September 6th, 1901. President McKinley is famous for his efficiency in reception lines. He can shake hundreds of hands per hour, guiding each person past. But this volume puts Secret Service on alert. They've even brought in extra agents and U.S. Army soldiers.
Secret Service? I could be wrong about this, but my understanding is the Secret Service does not start protecting the president until a few years after this. The Secret Service was created in April of 1865. It was one of the last things Abraham Lincoln did as president, was to create the Secret Service, but it's a part of the Treasury Department. It was created to deal with counterfeiting and things like that. It's only after McKinley's assassination that they start being assigned to protect the president. So I feel like there probably was local or even some governmental protection, but I very much doubt it was Secret Service. That said, I'm going to look it up to be sure because I don't want to tell you something wrong. Okay, so I learned something here. So while it's true that permanent Secret Service protection for the president didn't begin until after William McKinley, they did, from time to time, along with other agencies, provide security. And there were 3 Secret Service agents present at the Pan American Exposition. So well done, Extra History. You taught me something I didn't know. Let's go.
Standing in the exposition's Temple of Music, a performance hall, they scan the massive line. Because in the last 3 years, anarchist assassins have killed both the Empress of Austria and the King of Italy.
So the Empress of Austria, Sisi was her name. Interesting, she wasn't really targeted. She was on a trip and kind of keeping a low profile, and there was an anarchist there that was targeting someone else. And when he couldn't get his main target, and he happened to find out that the Empress of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was present, he went after her and he stabbed her. It was just kind of a crime of opportunity, really.
Anarchist publications have also identified McKinley as an enemy of the poor and downtrodden. And tonight, the agents are especially nervous about a tall black man waiting in line and are giving him extra scrutiny. Though it really is the man with an injured hand just ahead of him that should be their concern.
Right. I mean, you got an Ohioan president and you got a dude from Michigan. That should be your first clue. Now, it's fair to say, Leon Czolgosz, he's born in Michigan. He was not. I had some people on social media the other day when I was posting some McKinley stuff saying he was a foreigner. He wasn't. He was born in Michigan. His brother died in World War I fighting for the American Army in World War I. Died in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. But his family ended up living in the Cleveland area. Leon Czolgosz's parents, most of his siblings, are all buried in and around Cleveland.
He was waiting when McKinley exited his carriage yesterday. He'd attended McKinley's speech the night before and tried to get close to the stage. And his bandage conceals not a wound, but a pistol.
It's a .32 caliber, I think.
This headline-making episode is brought to you by Ground News, my personal go-to for navigating today's chaotic media landscape, and who we thank for supporting today's historical tale. With the close of the Spanish-American War and the decision to govern the Philippines directly, it initially appeared that McKinley was done with projecting force into the Pacific and Asia. Actually, he was just getting started. See, as America was setting up shop in the Philippines, other powers were moving into China in the wake of the First Sino-Japanese War.
Now, one thing I'll say, and I think they've kind of alluded to this already, and this does not justify the U.S. involvement in places like the Philippines, it was absolutely going to happen one way or another. And I think part of the mindset McKinley had, as was alluded to in previous episodes, was that if we don't do it, somebody else will, and they'll be worse than us. It doesn't make it okay, but it's kind of the same mindset that's going on right now. If you're following the news, there's the whole thing about Texas with gerrymandering, and now California says, well, if Texas is going to do it, we're going to do it, just to kind of offset them. And it doesn't make it right for either one of them to do it, but you can see how it kind of creates a domino effect.
These nations wrung economic concessions, intimidating Qing China into leasing portions of its territory or outright seized peninsulas and large areas. The biggest culprits were China's neighbors, Russia and Japan. This worried McKinley for a number of reasons. First being, access to China was the reason America created its bridge of territories across the Pacific.
Yep.
McKinley wanted to extract goods and resources and gain access to sell American goods to the theoretically massive Chinese market. And if the great powers carved up China, they could use their influence to freeze America out by playing...
It's all this, like these powers. It's kind of what's happening right now. You got the U.S. and Russia deciding what's going to happen with territory in Ukraine. It happened in World War II or before World War II with the Munich Agreement, where you've got these other powers deciding what's going to happen with Czechoslovakia. It's like these weaker nations, or perceived weaker nations, other powers are making decisions about their future.
With tariffs, denying them the use of ports, or charging American companies higher rates for using European or Japanese-built railways. Though McKinley also opposed this on cultural grounds. Despite both popular racism and America barring Chinese immigrants via the Chinese Exclusion Act, American elites tended to admire Chinese history, culture, and artwork. And there was a real fear that...
We love your history, your culture, and your artwork. Just keep it in China. Don't send any of your people to our West Coast.
Carving up China, as the great powers had divided Africa, would destroy China's cultural legacy.
They could have been next,
McKinley leaned on his Secretary of State to create one of the most pivotal foreign policy documents in the history of the United States.
And this Secretary of State, by the way, is John Hay, who's actually buried real close to John D. Rockefeller and James Garfield in the same cemetery in Cleveland, Ohio. John Hay was the private secretary, one of two private secretaries for Abraham Lincoln. The other one being Nicolay. And Hay, he eventually rises up and becomes Secretary of State not only for McKinley, but for Theodore Roosevelt as well.
The open door policy, circulated to the great powers in September of 1899. It argued that all the powers must respect Chinese territorial integrity, have equal access to markets, and standardize tariff and transport rates. While this gained reluctant agreement among the powers, the damage of interventionism had already been done.
Yeah, but let's say this is fair. I mean, the U.S. government policy could have been, let's divide it up and we'll go in on it with you guys in Europe. Instead, I think, while simultaneously protecting U.S. interests in the region by denying those opportunities to Europe, is also doing something that's a better option for China than letting Europe carve them up.
Foreign economic exploitation, colonialist behavior, and the rise in Western missionaries and Christian converts in China had triggered the formation of a pseudo-religious rebel group. Calling themselves the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, they held rallies that featured demonstrations of kung fu, vows to kill foreigners, and claims that bullets couldn't harm them. Westerners in China derisively nicknamed them the Boxers.
Yep.
But their scorn quickly turned to horror as the group led an uprising that massacred missionaries and Chinese converts and besieged foreigners inside the walled European-style neighborhoods in larger cities. McKinley's open door policy became intertwined with a developing war as the great powers began to draw up troops for an Allied intervention while also eyeing how to seize more of China. Believing that the alliance would start...
We're here to help you.
Carving up China, McKinley joined the Eight-Nation Alliance as a moderating influence and quickly rerouted troops from the Philippines to China. Indeed, the U.S. Marines scaling the walls of Beijing, the first to enter the imperial capital, became an enduring image of the conflict.
Yeah, and this is one of the places where you're going to see medals of honor for guys like, I think this is where John Daly gets his first Medal of Honor, is during the Boxer Rebellion.
And from afar, it looked quite tidy. Yet another splendid little war. But like with the Philippines and the Spanish-American War, the long-term reality was neither as splendid nor tidy as it appeared. First,
Did I say John Daly? He's a golfer, right? I'm talking about Dan Daly. and he did get his first Medal of Honor for the Boxer Rebellion.
Boxer Protocol, the resulting treaty, saddled China with a heavy indemnity that accelerated the Qing dynasty's decline and left it more vulnerable to foreign powers. And within a decade, two powers of the alliance, Japan and Russia, were fighting over Chinese possessions. America, now poised at the start of the 20th century as China's protector and with a footprint in the Pacific, was steered towards a collision with Japan. Meanwhile, the vast Chinese market never materialized since the population of China was largely too poor to buy American goods. Then you have the behavior of US troops during the Boxer Rebellion, who looted the Summer Palace in Beijing and often abused Chinese civilians, wounds inflicted that are still present to this day.
Yeah, and this is the unfortunate reality of being involved in these actions halfway around the world, is that this stuff does then reflect on the U.S. government, even though the U.S. government, William McKinley's intentions might be honorable, but these individual soldiers on the ground are going to make choices that are going to reflect on the entire United States government. And those are things that ultimately the president is responsible for.
And the Boxer Rebellion features prominently in Chinese history education as an example of why the country should beware of Western imperialism. McKinley also set a dark precedent when he ordered troops to China, becoming the first president to circumvent Congress when deploying the military into a war, a type of executive branch overreach that quickly became normalized. And there was discomfort with all this. A lot of Americans had voted for McKinley based on domestic issues. Instead, he'd spent most of his first term acquiring new territories and intervening in China. Moreover, many of the emotional reasons his administration had used to initiate these conflicts were not addressed. Cuba was not so much freed as it was becoming beholden to America. In the Philippines, U.S. combat deaths were now over 10 times the amount suffered during the Spanish-American War, and U.S. commanders increasingly used the same tactics that had spurred public outrage when Spain employed them in Cuba. Ultimately, between 200,000 and 250,000 Filipinos would die in the conflict, mostly civilians killed by disease and starvation, and swinging back to China, despite a lot of the noise made about protecting missionaries in the lead up to the Boxer Rebellion, the negotiations following the conflict focused on commercial issues. This meant that despite being massively popular due to two military victories, McKinley went into the election of 1900 with a couple of big vulnerabilities. And stepping up once again to exploit them was his old opponent, William Jennings Bryan.
And yet, for all of William Jennings Bryan's youthful vigor and the energy that he exudes in campaigning, he's just up against more than he can handle. He ends up, I think, the nominee 3 times in total, and he loses worse the second time than he did the first time.
Starting off, Bryan hit McKinley with the old economic and currency issues. But that held little weight since McKinley had already won the argument.
Right.
One of McKinley's first acts upon being inaugurated had been to reinstate the tariffs Grover Cleveland had lowered, bringing them back up to around 49%. But McKinley was more targeted about it than in 1890. While this did increase domestic production in some industries like steel, it also did raise prices, particularly for industries like construction and railroads. In fact, this increase in particularly steel began to suggest to McKinley that the tariffs had done their work and that global trade was the next economic horizon. Similarly, he'd experiment.
The bottom line is, when you believe in a policy, you can interpret the data in such a way that convinces people that it's working, whether it is or not. And people are always cherry picking the data points that they want to say, look, see, this proves it. And they might be right, but they might be ignoring other factors in which it doesn't go along with what they think.
Did early in his presidency with mixing silver supply into the gold standard, but other nations he spoke to about a unified effort weren't keen. And the whole thing was rendered moot when rich gold strikes around the world increased the global gold supply. Thus, he finally reaffirmed the gold standard in 1900 and pegged the dollar to its price. But while America's rapid economic expansion, partially due to its new territories, partially due to a manufacturing boom, had softened the blows of the tariffs, they often...
Yeah, remember, because there was a panic back in 1893, there was a crash in the economy, so the economy's recovering from that, and so McKinley comes into office on the back of that, and the economy is steadily improving. And so people are going to look back and say, well, you know what, in 1900 things are better than they were in 1896.
Were hard on small businesses. The ones that could survive the shock of higher prices were the big corporate structures known as the trusts, who ruled over Gilded Age America. And that was actually McKinley's biggest political vulnerability. He was largely a creature of big business, and Bryan went after him as being in the pocket of business tycoons. He threaded this in with the narrative about McKinley's imperialist presidency, playing on that image of him as Napoleon, and questioning moves like McKinley's puzzling decision to leave the office of the vice president empty when Gary Hobart suddenly died in November of 1899.
It's not a puzzling decision. There was nothing in place. There was no procedure in place to replace the vice president. That didn't come about until later in the 20th century, which is why the other times you see a vacancy in the vice presidency, like when Theodore Roosevelt becomes president after McKinley is assassinated, he has no vice president for 4 years. There was nothing in the Constitution. There was no law in place to allow for a replacement of that. That's why it's only happened just the one time with Gerald Ford being made vice president after Spiro Agnew resigned, because that was the only time it's happened since the law has been in place.
Despite his strong position, McKinley's camp did worry that Bryan's populist attacks were landing. Because, well, I mean, there was some truth to them. McKinley did many things in his presidency, but in a domestic sense, he was not fulfilling America's most pressing need. Because this was the dawn of the progressive era, one where America would put its shoulder behind industrialization, but also champion social causes, like union protections, breaking up monopolies, labor rights, women's rights, and child labor. But McKinley, to put it mildly, was just not...
I was talking about this, I hit the wrong button, talking to Matt Beat about this earlier today, actually, and we were talking about how, we see these moments in history where there seem to be rapid amounts of progress in a short period of time, and then things kind of slow back down. We saw that after the American Civil War. You've got, in rapid succession, you've got the freeing of the slaves of the 13th Amendment. You've got black citizenship. You've got the right to vote for people regardless of their color. And then now in the progressive era, you're going to have a series of reforms for business and the workday and safety for workers and things like that. You're going to have women getting the right to vote. You're going to have a change to things like creating the income tax and the change to how senators are elected, all within a couple of years.
That guy. In fact, while he had campaigned as the friend of the workers and a progressive voice, McKinley consistently proved more talk than action. He'd privately say he was for women's suffrage and even court women's lobby groups, but then wouldn't take a public position. He'd spoken strongly against lynching as governor, but as president, when an armed white supremacist mob overthrew the biracial government of Wilmington, North Carolina, killing up to 300 people and expelling the city's black population, he said nothing. Instead, he courted Southern votes in the 1900 election by wearing a gray badge to show his sympathy with the Confederate dead, and promised to bring Confederate cemeteries under federal jurisdiction.
This was a time in history when that was pretty common, though, and this is actually when a lot of the military bases get renamed for Confederate generals. It's when a lot of the statues go up in the South, the ones that we've been talking a lot about in the last decade or so that have been torn back down. And part of that is white supremacy. There's a lot of people in these southern states. This is around the time of Plessy versus Ferguson, when the Supreme Court is going to rule that segregation is legal if it's separate but equal. So as long as you have water, drinking fountains for both blacks and whites, it's okay if they're separate. As long as you have schools available for blacks and whites, it's okay if they're separate. Things like that. But there is also a very strong viewpoint to kind of bringing everybody together, North and South, and fighting under a common cause. World War I and World War II, you see a lot. Franklin Roosevelt, same thing. Watch his speech when he dedicates the Peace Light Memorial at Gettysburg, and he speaks about, it doesn't matter to us what flag you fought over in the 1860s. We're all under one flag now. There was a lot of that kind of thing going on.
Simultaneously, he did invite black members of Congress to serve as his advisors privately, and appointed a large number of black postmasters, which is not nothing, especially since at this time, local postmasters were big figures locally and often operated their mail, banking, and notary services out of their home.
That's true.
By appointing African Americans to the role, McKinley was creating a context where whites would need to visit the home of a black public official and treat them with respect.
And this happens under McKinley, it happens under Theodore Roosevelt, and then under William Howard Taft, and then you get to Woodrow Wilson, and he rolls all of that back and institutes segregation within the federal workforce and undoes a lot of what has been happening over the previous 40 years under presidents trying to increase opportunities for African Americans in the federal government.
But then, flipping that coin on its third side, he never pushed back about the increasing restrictions on the black population of the Jim Crow South. Even when one of his
There it is again, was it Walpole up in the corner? Why do you have to do this to me every single time, Extra History? Every time.
Masters was murdered, he did not speak out. But McKinley's camp thought there was a way to capture some of that rising progressive appetite for reform, as well as further burnish his military achievements and gain an advocate for expansionism by drafting progressive voice, Rough Rider war hero, and rabid imperialist Theodore Roosevelt as his new vice president. Also, it would get Roosevelt out of New York politics, where he was becoming a nuisance with his reform crusades and feuds with the Tammany Hall political machine.
So Theodore Roosevelt had been in state politics for a while. Then he becomes like the New York City police commissioner. And then he becomes assistant secretary of the Navy, which is kind of interesting because Franklin Roosevelt ends up having the exact same role in government later on, assistant secretary of the Navy. And then he leaves his role in the Navy Department to go and serve in the Spanish-American War, raises this volunteer company, and then becomes the governor of New York very briefly before becoming vice president.
Roosevelt joining the ticket reinforced McKinley's weaknesses and gave him an exciting advocate who could match Bryan's energetic speaking course. And it cinched the election for McKinley. But, as longtime confidant Mark Hanna put it, placed the madman Roosevelt one heartbeat from the presidency. Which brings us nicely back to the Temple of Music at the World's Fair on September 6th, 1901. Less than a year into McKinley's second term, he'd come to this celebration of his achievement. This Pan-American exposition with its exhibits on emerging technology, manufacturing, and America's new colonial possessions.
Yeah, in fact, not only less than a year, it's 6 months into his second term.
His security detail wanted to cancel this greeting line for being too dangerous. After all, the anarchist who had killed King Umberto I of Italy the previous year had been an Italian immigrant who volunteered and trained for the killing in New Jersey. McKinley answered, "Who would want to hurt me?" He reaches out for the next person in line, a man with a bandaged hand. His name is Leon Czolgosz, a Polish-American man born in Detroit. A former steelworker, he had become disillusioned with America's economic model after witnessing a series of bloody strikes. Czolgosz quit, complaining of poor health, and moved home to stew in isolation, reading increasingly radical anarchist literature. Months before, he had stalked the country's most prominent anarchist, Emma Goldman, and briefly met her twice.
So, fascinating thing. After we went to the McKinley home the other day, me and Matt, I came home and I went to newspaper articles from the Cleveland Plain Dealer, which is the big paper in Cleveland, and I was reading the papers in the days after the assassination, September 7th, 8th, 9th, just to kind of see how they were reporting all this. And like September 8th, which is, a day and a half after the assassination, they had Leon Czolgosz's photo on the front page. They were already talking about his connections to anarchists like Emma Goldman. They had a lot of this stuff. They were nailing this story pretty quickly.
To Czolgosz, McKinley represented the worst of America. The rising gap between the rich and poor, the greed of the trusts, and the horrible war crimes he'd begun reading about in the Philippines. He raises the pistol. Czolgosz fires twice before the crowd jumps him. The first to take him down being the large man behind him the Secret Service had flagged as problematic. And the crowd might have beat him to death right there, except McKinley, not realizing how badly he'd been wounded, begged for them to go easy.
I don't even know whether he realized how badly he had been wounded or not. He knew he had been shot, but it was just, you find out a lot about a person's character in those moments, how they react in the moment of stress. And this guy had just been shot twice. And his first two thoughts, number one, are don't beat the guy to death who just shot me. And then secondly, be careful how you break the news to my invalid wife. And that shows you a lot about his character, I think.
McKinley was rushed to the expedition's bare-bones hospital clinic, but there was no one qualified.
An OBGYN worked on him.
The nearest gunshot expert, it turned out, was engaged in a delicate cranial surgery at that very moment and stated that he could not stop even to help the President of the United States. The two doctors who treated McKinley had no history with gunshot wounds, and the surgery itself proved difficult. The president was a big man, and while they extracted one bullet, finding the other would have involved digging nearly elbow deep into his abdomen.
And understand that this is 20 years after this exact scenario happened with James Garfield, another Northeast Ohio Republican president, war hero, who was shot twice, was shot at twice. I can't remember if both bullets entered him. Another big guy. He was like 6 foot, 210 pounds. And in that case, the doctors kept digging and digging for the bullet, ended up killing Garfield with the infection. Had they just left the bullet alone, he probably would have walked away from it. He'd have been fine in a few weeks.
And removing his stomach and intestines. So they sewed him up and hoped for the best. At first, McKinley appeared to strengthen, yet...
Yeah, so I told you earlier I was reading these newspaper articles, and the first day, like September 7th, September 8th, the articles are talking about how McKinley's situation is really grave, and they've called for the vice president to come, and Roosevelt comes. But then as you get into like the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, the reports are all, doctors say he's going to be fine, he's improving, he's great, he's in, all of the reports for like 5 days where McKinley's recovering, he's going to be fine. And even the day before he died, the report was he's doing great. And then the next day, the headline is president's dead. It happened that quickly.
5 days in, he showed clear indications of gangrene, and there was nothing to be done.
Yeah, both Garfield and McKinley with modern medicine would have easily survived their wounds.
After being shot, William McKinley died, with Ida at his side, singing the hymn, Nearer My God to Thee. Her mental health, already fragile, could not stand up to the grief, and she was unable to attend the funeral or his internment.
Yeah, so Mark Hanna, who was a senator at this point, good friend of McKinley's, so one of the last people to be with him, he goes in, and the president's unconscious by this point, and he's talking to him, Mr. President, I'm here. And then he says, William, don't you know me? It's Mark. And McKinley kind of recognized him, but by that point was kind of incoherent and in and out of consciousness. And they said that Senator Hanna wept openly over his friend, as did a lot of people.
The country entered a period of national mourning, draping his portrait in black and fundraising for an enormous tomb and memorial in his hometown of Canton, Ohio. Ida would join him there 6 years after his death.
And their girls. So the tomb, there's a cemetery right behind the tomb, and their girls were buried there. McKinley's parents were buried there. And so William, Mrs. McKinley, and their two daughters, Catherine and, is it Ida, I think, are buried there.
Leon Czolgosz, for his part, was nearly lynched before standing trial and proved a poor firebrand, failing to make any dramatic statement in court or to newspapers. The jury voted him guilty with such speed, they waited to re-enter the courtroom to suggest they had considered the question seriously. He went to the electric chair only 7 weeks after the assassination, having achieved nothing except initiating a crackdown on American anarchists.
Yeah, so unlike with Charles Guiteau, who assassinated Garfield 20 years earlier, he was like a year after he shot Garfield before he was hanged. This time it was like boom, 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 it was done. By the end of October, he was dead.
Overshadowed by his more dynamic successor, Roosevelt, McKinley's presidency then faded into obscurity, despite the fact that he had set up one of Roosevelt's principal achievements, beginning negotiations to take over the abandoned French effort to build a canal through Panama. But today, it is clear that McKinley should be remembered as a pivotal figure, the architect of the American century. His name spoken with respect in his hometown, but frequently with less warmth in Hawaii, Cuba, and the Philippines.
Understandable. Totally understandable. Loving seeing the Ohio flag there.
A man from Ohio who changed the world, even when he did not mean to.
Great series. I thought they handled it really well. I thought it was very even-handed, talking about the positives and the negatives and exploring all of that. What do you think they missed? What else should we talk about? Let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.